Howdy, Googlers and those tuning in from on our YouTube channel. I'm Gabriel Stricker, and I work in global communications and public affairs here. And I'm here to introduce a really spectacular book called Mr. Fooster Traveling on a Whim. It's a really magical story, and it is written by Tom Corwin and illustrated by Craig Frazier. I'm going to talk in a second about them. One of the remarkable things about this book that caught our eye and really made us want to invite Tom and Craig to come in and talk to us today is the kind of extraordinary web presence that this book has. It is an illustrated book, but what they have done online to help tell this story is really remarkable. And so we're actually going to see some of what that is, the online presence of this book today. First, we're going to see that, and then they are going to do a live recreation of that with spoken word and with music as well. But before we see that, let me just give a quick word or two about Tom and Craig. Tom actually has his background in music as a performer, bassist, with some extraordinary other musicians, including Bonnie Raitt, Booker T of Booker T and the MGs fame, and Patti LaBelle. Tom has sort of shifted his focus out of the performing realm and most recently into the production realm, where he's produced music for equally extraordinary people, Bonnie Raitt again, but also others of the likes of Stevie Wonder. This is Tom's second book. His first book was called Mostly Bob, which is a story in the spirit of the digital age that we're living in that grew out of an email that Tom sent to his closest friends announcing the death of his beloved dog, and grew out of this email into an actual physical book. So this is very much Tom's familiarity and awareness of harnessing the digital age is very clear. Craig Frazier is an extraordinary illustrator and designer. His work can be found in the permanent collection of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. On top of that, you can see his illustrations in popular publications such as the New York Times op-ed page, Time Magazine, Fortune, Forbes, Business Week, Fast Company. And if that wasn't enough, Craig has also designed 3 stamps for the U.S. Postal Service. I don't know what denominations they were, but I'm sure you guys can ask Craig that. They were very expensive stamps. But I know you all are here not to hear me, but to hear them. And so the first version of them and their work is going to be the digital one. So without further ado, let's see Chapter 1 of Mr. Fooster Traveling on a Whim online. And then after that, we're going to hear from Tom and Craig.
Mr. Fooster has a long list of things he likes to do. One is dreaming. Another is looking for arrowheads. On this Tuesday morning, he did neither. He simply put an old wrinkled letter back in its envelope, placed it in his coat pocket, and headed out the door with no particular place to go. As he walked, his mind began to wander. How was it that prophets could manifest things and he couldn't? How come mandarin oranges came in perfect little segments without any mechanical engineering? Why was it that bubbles bobbled to and fro, yet always found their way back to a perfect sphere? Sooner than later, he stumbled on a small rock, which jostled him from his odd meanderings. He looked down and saw a katydid. The katydid did something unusual. She smiled. In all his days, Mr. Fooster had never seen a katydid smile. It took him quite by surprise. But he pulled himself together quickly and ambled onward. As his mind wandered off again, his feet set a rhythm, and he began to whistle to himself. The spontaneous melody was hypnotic, and before he knew it, it was nightfall, and he did not recognize his surroundings. How could he get back home in time for bed? All he had with him was his compass and an old bottle of bubble soap. He sat on a stump and waited for the answer. As boredom set in, he pulled out that old bottle of bubble soap, unscrewed the top, and poked around for the little red wand. As he blew his first bubble, he knew something odd was happening. The bubble just kept coming, and it was not shaping into a sphere, but rather an old DeSoto sedan, exactly like the one his grandfather used to drive. As he reached the end of his breath, the bubble became whole and plopped onto the road in front of him. Baffled by this apparition, he wallowed in a lazy moment of puzzling pause. Then, following his instinct, Mr. Fooster hopped in and drove the DeSoto home, arriving just in time for bed. In the morning, Mr. Fooster lay in bed, gazed at the ceiling, and considered yesterday's outing. Rising from his comfortable cotton sheets, he peeked out the window, squinted, stared, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. Lo and behold, there stood the DeSoto, green, shiny, and proud. Before leaving the house, he listed the DeSoto on eBay in hopes of raising funds for his favorite charity, the Pickle Family Circus. As he headed out, he checked the compass in his pocket. It pointed north. He headed west with thoughts of swimming to Cambodia. Over hill and dale he walked with a floating feeling in his step. As he progressed toward the ocean, his thoughts traveled to faraway places. Why were ducks so fuel efficient? How come you never see baby pigeons? Who figured out how to eat artichokes? Suddenly, a very large shadow roused him from his train of thought, and he found himself facing a bug the size of a bulldozer. He stared in amazement as the grumpy bug munched on the trunk of a linden tree. With 3 orange spots on his forehead and crunching munching sounds from his cavernous mouth, the big bug addressed Mr. Fooster. I, dear sir, am eating a path around the world. Each day I consume everyone and everything that crosses my trail until I am full. Yesterday, I ate a freight train, an oak tree, and a bird whistle. It is endless and serious work, but this is how I must make my mark on the world. Mr. Fooster appeared to be in hot water. The big bug continued. Before I sprinkle some salt on your toes and add you to my lunch menu, I have one question. I can see from the lightness in your step that you're traveling on a whim. What makes you so content? Mr. Fooster considered the question as a flock of ducks passed overhead. He could hear the wind under their wings. Unsure how to address the big bug, he instinctively reached into his pocket and pulled out his bubble soap. He dipped his fingers into the thick, soupy soap, raised the wand to his lips, and began to blow. A bubble slowly emerged. It stretched, warped, and swayed this way and that, bobbling and schnobbling, wibbling and wobbling. Its enormity became truly baffling. As it eclipsed the size of the DeSoto and dwarfed the big bug, it struggled to find its final shape. Alas, the bubble broke free of the wand and floated off to the west in the likeness of an immense birdcage filled with vibrant, floating tropical fish. As he reached the horizon, The cage door opened, and all the beautiful fish swam out and soared into the clouds. The big bug smiled so wide that his joy lifted him into the air. In an instant, he saw the silliness of his seriousness, and in his reverie, he too floated off into the horizon. As he disappeared into the skyline, the tracings of two jubilant words were heard erupting from his mouth. Chili Mambo! Mr. Fooster watched with a curious look on his face and continued on his journey. Three days passed as Mr. Fooster walked day and night, each step just as light as the one before. He could imagine the ocean breeze and the blue water that awaited just over the next mountain. Occasionally, he would look up from his rambling thoughts and notice something new: the call of a seabird, the smell of a juniper bush, or a poker chip left in the dust. As he neared the next hilltop, he stopped to look at a pothole. An exhausted newt gazed back at him and asked for directions to the nearest swamp. From the look in his eyes, Mr. Fooster could tell the newt was weak. Hearing the distant sound of running water through the woods to the north, he decided to help. Picking up the newt and placing him on his shoulder, he headed toward the sound of the creek. With the newt on his shoulder, conversation came easily and telepathically. Their talk was heartfelt, deep, and meaningful. The newt's world, it seemed, existed solely of puddles, potholes, and mud. He had never heard of the ocean, tasted salt water, or seen a sailboat, but was determined to quest out into the wilds beyond to prove his strength and importance to the other newts in the marsh. The cacophony of frogs chattering in the distance gave assurance that Mr. Fooster was closing in on the bog. Coming upon a mud puddle, he carefully placed the newt in, belly first. As he turned to head back to the road, he noticed how perfect and stinky the newt's swamp was. Another day passed before Mr. Fooster's shoes touched the sand. As he stepped to the water's edge, he gazed at his reflection. His desire to swim had passed, but a rowboat called out to him. He stepped in, took the oars, and headed off for a better look at the horizon. The water shimmered with the reflection of the sun, as if he were rowing through a big pot of gold. As he settled into a comfortable pace, he considered why bathtubs were always too short for comfort. How come the letter P was included in the word psychology? And what a burden gravity was when you had to move an oven. As he pondered, he noticed his rowing became easier and lighter. The heat of the sun warmed his back, and the day took on a deeper meaning. Time passed easily as he floated to the beach and returned the rowboat to its mooring. With sea salt on his hat, he faced west one last time. While he was admiring the orange sunset, some small objects fell from the sky and landed half buried in the sand in front of him. As he looked down, he noticed the corner of a tiny wood block. Slowly kneeling, Mr. Fooster pulled a handful of Scrabble tiles out of the sand and placed them in his pants pocket. Then, reaching out his arms, he gathered up a piece of the ocean to show the newt on his walk home. So now we would like to invite Craig up, and we're going to talk a little bit about the making of Mr. Fooster, which came around in a really sort of unusual fashion. And I'll begin by telling you its infancy was born of my seeing Craig's work out in the world. I didn't know Craig, but I sort of kept running into his work, and I was just moved deeply by his art. And I eventually contacted him and told him I was really moved, and I just wanted to meet him. I had no agenda. But shortly after we met, I noticed I said to him one day across the table, Craig, I feel like I could write a book based on any one of your illustrations. And at that time, I didn't feel like I had the right to suggest a collaboration. So I decided to take a covert action. And I picked one of his illustrations and just went at it without telling him. And I was about 3/4 of the way through the manuscript when I got up the guts to show it to him. And he was taken by it, and at that point we began a collaboration. And this is the illustration that I picked to start the story. And I just sort of tuned into, so who is this guy? What is this story? And out came Mr. Fooster. And so now Craig's going to talk a little bit about developing his side of the book and sort of about the creative boomerang that we were together in the evolution of the story in the final book.
Hello. I just showed you a few of the images that I do sort of as my day job to sort of set the stage for this, as Tom did, about how we got together and how he was inspired to write the book. So the story appeared. Tom presented it to me in a manuscript form and said he was inspired to write this, and I was obviously just moved by the mere idea of that. Really, it had been unsuggested in any way, shape, or form before this that he was working on a book that he wanted me to illustrate. And so I studied it and said, well, geez, obviously we have to do this. And I was extremely taken by what he had done based on one drawing that I had produced with the man with the bubble, and sort of set out to sort of set the tone of what this book would be like. And so this began the collaborative process of defining who this character is, what he would look like, what the book ultimately would look like. And this is really sort of like starting with a block of clay and starting to form it. And the interesting thing is that the two people you see up here have very defined opinions of what things ought to be. And they were not necessarily the same. So what you see here is sort of a first swing at it. I took the manuscript and just did a kind of a rough sketch. This is much more like the way in which I draw for my day job, if you will. And in any event, the way I work is somewhat half analog and half digital. What you see here is a scanned sketch and colored. But I sort of threw this out, showed it to Tom, and I said, does this feel like the guy? And we kind of said, I don't know. Well, let's see what else how else might he feel? So I kind of took some more passages from the book, and again, this is the katydid passage that you saw, and drew that and said, well, does that feel right? For some reason, for me, it felt a little bit rich. This is sort of an interesting, probably one of the very first points of contention, of which there were not many, by the way. But Tom had envisioned these rich, beautiful color illustrations, and determined to make this a difficult process, I said, that's not what I wanted to do. And so, and part of this is that when you drew something, my day job is sort of the drawings that you saw up there, they sort of have one root, and I kind of wanted this to have its own life and have its own being and its own ownership and relationship to the story. So I said, well, what if we kind of move off of that? And so I continued to experiment. Here's another one, character still slightly different. But I still wasn't satisfied that it was the right character. And I showed these to you a few times, didn't I? And you kind of... Yeah, okay. So I started to go off in a place that was really not initially of Tom's liking, which was to abandon the color and start to look at what if this thing was monochromatic and kind of sort of had less information, if you will. So you can see it starts to get get very graphic.
I just want to chime in at this point to say, I was heartbroken. I really was. I was like, I envisioned this rich color from the beginning through this whole creation, and then he's like, no color. But I really have so much faith and trust in Craig's artistic genius that I surrendered. And I think ultimately that paid off.
Well, and I'm going to tell you the moral of the story well in advance of telling you the story, is that a project like this is entirely personal. This is just something about, something that we wanted to do together, and the pursuit was to enjoy the process and enjoy the outcome of the process. And so I had to take very personal note of my interest in not doing something that I had already done before. And so I kind of went into my sketchbook and started saying, well, what if I go the other direction, go very, very simple and do something that's just much more sketchy? And so I look back, and I've captured some of these images just to show you sort of the rough thinking that goes on as you build a character. And, I started doing just these pen and ink drawings, which I've always drawn in, but I've never really published. And so you start to see some resemblances of the drawings that are in the book right now. And I started to feel very satisfied with this look. It felt a little bit journalistic. It felt much more narrative. And for me, the act of drawing these was much more patient. This is not a digital experience. It's a a very analog experience, even though they were captured digitally and the book is produced that way. So I started to find a very comfortable resting place. At this point, I showed them to Tom, and he started to believe in this direction, that it was the right direction for Mr. Fooster.
Although I'd like, if you can go back to the last slide, I think this was one of the first moments where, I had something to say that maybe did influence the art, because Craig showed me this illustration. I thought, we should never see Mr. Fooster's face. Like, he should be a mystery. And there's something about Mr. Fooster. He's this character who I think you get to take a ride through his eyes. And to do that, it's important that you really never see his eyes. And that you also really, in terms of character study, he doesn't have a lot of detail. Like, he's not a character who you could really like or dislike. And that was really important, so that you could walk these steps, through his eyes.
So we're getting comfortable with him, and we started to sort of zone in on, okay, time to look at the book. What would it really look like? And this was probably the first sketch that I considered to be more of a finished sketch. I said, okay, this feels like it, and this is much like the first sketch in the book. This is not in the book, actually. But, in the process, if you draw, you kind of walk around the drawing for a long time until you finally say, okay, I'm going to commit and I'm going to do a drawing that ultimately will be a finished drawing. And that's where I was here. At the same time, Tom and I were defining the nature of the book, saying, well, does it have 10 drawings in it? Does it have 15 drawings? Well, no, it actually has 52 drawings. We decided there's a drawing on every single page. And so
that was when Craig went, oi.
That's the book we're talking about doing. Again, here's another drawing. Here's the DeSoto. Here's the bug. So I was kind of working around some of the characters that appear in the book and wanting to assure myself that I could characterize them. This isn't the drawing you saw. This is one of the early sketches for it. Again, another sketch. So we then built a layout. I put this together, and we started saying, what's the book? What is its physical form? There are little short passages on each spread with a large illustration. So we arrived at that and agreed on that, and set out to get a publishing deal. So how did we do that? We then became digital very quickly. We took the first 3 chapters. I did rough illustrations for all of them, which is maybe 12 drawings or 14 drawings. And we built a little mock-up. And then this is a little print-on-demand digital book that we put, I believe we made 10 copies and put in the hands of our agent, who took it to New York and in 1 week had a publishing deal. So then this thing became very real. This was no longer just a an idea, we now had a contract and a commitment to deliver this project. So from my point of view as a designer and the illustrator, I had to get my arms quickly around what needed to get done in the next year. Tom, for the most part, had completed the manuscript. I say the most part. I mean, we had 100 pages of text. There were details that had to be worked out, but for the most part, it was there. And so this is the way we began to work together. We took just a typewritten manuscript, and with lines defined where the page breaks were throughout the book. And out in the margin, I did some kind of a little postage stamp thumbnail of what we thought would go on that page. And part of this is like making a movie. It's framing up all the scenes, knowing what one illustration is going to look like relative to the one before and the one after. And at the same time, really the two of us agreeing that's the illustration that best portrays what's going on that page. And in a collaboration, this is where you start to find out that a story has many meanings, because I would come in with a sketch and Tom would say, that's not at all what I was thinking was going to be on this page. Did you want to say something?
Yeah. But also there were times along the way when Craig would also say, it would be really nice if something else happened here. And so it got tossed back towards me as well. And I would go in, and there was one example where Craig said, it'd be really nice if something happened here with a Scrabble tile. And I thought, that's a really cool idea. What could I do with a Scrabble tile? And I went home and sort of, explored it and came up with this idea of the Scrabble tiles dropping out of the sky onto Mr. Fooster's at his feet. And that then they played a role in the story as it went on. They sort of become puzzle pieces in the story. And so those, it got tossed back and forth in that way. And although we submitted a final manuscript, there were suggestions Craig had along the way where the story actually changed and was manipulated.
So again, this is sort of further documentation. I work in these little moleskin sketchbooks, and this is a way of not having 1 year of sheer panic. I found that if I could get, a number of the sketches at least into a thumbnail form, I could have some comfort that, okay, I know what the idea of that drawing is going to be. Sitting down to doing the drawing is something else, and it's very pleasurable, and it's a completely different moment than this kind of moment. But until I had all these sketches formed, there was some degree of uncertainty whether or not this could actually be accomplished. And keep in mind, again, it's like a movie. There's a thread that has to run throughout the book, and so sometimes I'd be reserved about committing to a drawing thinking that, well, it may not work in the very end of the story. So the drawings were not done chronologically, by the way. So they all the finished drawings reside in 2 big volumes, the big books, and then the smaller ones were used for sort of feeder sketches. And this is what goes on for any particular drawing. There's lots of little scrawlings of what would the camera angle be, what's the information on it. This book, he's in the out of doors all of the time, with the exception of maybe one drawing, and there's lots of trees and foliage. So I was constantly studying and taking photographs of landscapes and foliage and trees. This particular one had DeSoto in it, so you have to get very exact reference to a DeSoto, which was a perfect car to choose. Quite lovely to draw. And that's the finished drawing. The bug also appears. So one day, Tom and I had to go to the city and find a bug.
We went bug shopping.
So we went and got this bug.
It's very expensive.
He was
amazed how much a bug can cost.
It was very expensive. And then I had to hybridize him a little bit so that he had all the features that I wanted. This was a digital manipulation of him. But he appears in many times in the book, and so I constantly used him, right in my, sitting on the end of the pen to draw from. You'll see each of these drawings have a rubber stamp at the bottom. There are 2 reasons for it. They have a number, a catalog number, which is the particular page in the book that it appears in, and then there is a date, just for sake of dating, and then there's a signature, because I didn't approve all of my own drawings. Not all of them made the cut. And when I did the scan, this is the digital part that's so fun, is that when I scanned each of the scan has the rubber stamp in it, and then the book gets a rubber stamped S that has been scanned, and that's done. So that when I open up the picture window in Photoshop, I could see exactly where this drawing belongs. Believe it or not, to this day, I don't have the order of them memorized. You'd think I would, but I don't. And it's a very, very simple, old-fashioned system. So, I mean, as it pertains to you guys that are down here working in the most high-tech of the digital world, you know, there's a place where both of them have to meet, and this was a lovely part of the book. I think that these funky old rubber stamps that then traveled in the Photoshop files. What I'm just trying to show you here is sort of the resemblance and how something grows and gets a little better when you draw it a couple times. I suppose if I drew these 2 more times, they'd be really good, but eventually you have to turn the assignment in.
You notice there wasn't an area for my signature in this stamp, which is very telling, but we'll talk about that after the show.
That is true. That is true. There were some that were rejected by Tom, though, I will tell you that, and that was an ugly, ugly signature. This process is, again, this one points to our collaboration, but I work very small, and these are that's not a large pencil, it's a normal size pencil, so the sketches are about a half an inch tall. And what I'm working with is just form. I felt like the character ought to be very, very graphic, and because this bubble is so, his bubble wand is so integral to the whole story, it seemed like that was going to be a part of the signature. And the rest is type. And so it's all a matter of exploration. And, you know, I started here in 1980 in Palo Alto in a design firm when we did everything this way by hand and watched the computer come along. And one of the big mistakes that I myself have even experienced is that we rush in and start designing on the computer too fast. And we end up with only the language of the computer and not really this intuition that we have about space and form. And to me, I can build any one of the covers from these little cryptic, you know, postage stamps. And I can do that many in a matter of minutes. And so this is a comfortable place to work. I didn't show these to Tom, again, part of our true collaboration. But I did show him these. And I then went to produce, this is how insecure I was about the cover, that I produced 32 of them to see what they look like in the flesh.
Now, I'd like to pick up this part of the story because, you know, he didn't actually show me this. He could have, but no. He called me and said, I'm ready to show you some covers. So I think he may have prepared me when I came over. There were going to be 32. And he, you know, it was in a room. He had set up 32 covers in a room all around like this. And they were all beautifully rendered in life-size covers. I mean, life-size in terms of the book. And I really respect him sort of giving me the space to just walk in and express my own opinion after that much work. And honestly, I walked into the room and I looked at all of them, and they were, each and every one of them, really beautiful. They really were. But it took me about 1 minute. And I said, Craig, they are each and every one beautiful. And I am absolutely sure which one is the cover of the book. And I went over and picked it up and put it on the desk. And he said, I agree. And at that point, we just, as a study, we took, you know, our 3-4 favorites and brought them to a bookstore and actually set them up in the stacks to see what they would look like. And it really proved out. We felt like, you know, this sort of best represented Mr. Fooster in terms of a first glance. I mean, the cover is so important.
It's kind of fun to look back at them, though, and see, what if. Of course, that's the final cover. And for all you soon-to-be authors out there, the process is different with all different publishers. I've done 5 or 6 books now, and many of them want to see a lot of covers, and they get in these closed-door meetings rooms and wrestle around, and then one comes out under the door and says, "This is the one you choose." This particular publisher was really amazing, and we sent one cover. We didn't send the other 31 covers, and said, "This is one that we picked," and they said, "Lovely, go with it."
Yeah, we were incredibly lucky with our publisher Doubleday, and they really let us lead the entire process in the story and in the illustrations. It was a real gift.
So what I want to do now is just show a dozen or so of the finished drawings that you have not seen yet, and we're going to accompany that with a little more music from Mr. Gowan Matthews, and then Tom is going to do one more reading of one more chapter, and then we'll open up for questions.
So we thought we'd close with Chapter 5. It speaks a little to Mr. Fooster's own travails. It's not all an easy ride for him. Days passed as Mr. Fooster walked on. By the 5th day, his compass had spun 1,000 rotations. He had walked through a myriad of twists, turns, and spirals. There was not only no end in sight, but by all appearances, no end at all. Mr. Fooster's feet began to feel heavier with each step. Standing in the sunlight, he considered his predicament. As he bathed in the warmth of the afternoon light, he felt his shoes begin to tenderly vibrate. When he tried to take another step, he found the soles of his feet were growing roots into the ground. Unable to move, Mr. Fooster turned his attention inward. How do ladybugs make baby bugs without man bugs? Can lightning really knock your socks off? Is it possible there is really no word that rhymes with orange? As his thoughts wandered on, he noticed a prickly sensation in his arms and legs. It was an odd feeling, as if all his limbs were going to sleep at one time. A moment later, he began to sprout leaves. As his leaves grew, a lovely smell, not unlike fresh vine-ripened tomatoes, filled the air. Over the next few days, he grew more accustomed to standing in one place. He watched with curiosity as porcupines and woodchucks passed by, occasionally stopping to sniff his legs. Every now and then, he'd feel the tickle of an earthworm loosening the soil as it slithered under his feet. As his roots grew, Mr. Fooster sensed their hungry search for water, and it occurred to him that his journey might be over. Summer came and went. The brisk fall air whispered of a coming frost. Mr. Fooster's nose grew pink as winter approached. One day, the sky turned gray and a big snow covered the forest like a heavy down comforter. The thick white blanket brought even deeper moments of silence. There was a true hush in the air. Mr. Fooster could feel the rhythms of nature quietly aching to come back to life. So now we'd like to thank you very much. And this is Gowan Matthews, who's a wonderful collaborator on the music for Mr. Fooster. So, yeah, we're opening up to questions on anything having to do with Mr. Fooster or otherwise. Yes. There's not a sequel in the works at this moment, but you never know. Yeah.
I found that when I was watching it on the internet and here as well, the pictures filled the screen, both on the internet and here. But upon first cracking open the book, the pictures don't fill the pages, and I kind of wish they would. Was there a reason why they're minimized or so small?
Believe me, I looked at that particular option too. I mean, you look at everything. Part of it is that if you look at the drawings, there's always an open space on them of white. They're not completely framed. So that white border around them allows you to go in and back out of the drawing. There was something about making them feel a little bit precious on the page. And it's just instinctual. I don't know. Believe me, we looked at whether the book should be bigger, whether they should be full bleed images like you're describing, and maybe we should have done it that way.
Nah.
It's a good question.
Would you consider, I mean, I don't have children, obviously. I don't have children, but I imagine that if I did, or maybe someday when I do, I would love to read this to them, but this format doesn't quite lend itself so well to reading to children. Would there be a contemplation of making a large version of it to read to
That's a great idea. Yeah, the question is whether this book would lend itself to be made in a larger format for reading to children. Certainly, that certainly, is a possibility and would be easy to do. Now, you probably have read it to a child.
I have read it a bit to my child, and when you read I think it would be lovely to blow it up. I really do. And also, when you read to your child, because I have a 4-year-old, and we do a lot of that every night. You sort of cuddle up and snuggle together, and the book is sort of right there in front of you, tight and center. And Mr. Fooster does read okay to kids. I think it would be lovely if it was bigger. But it's I think one slightly interesting part of the story. I mean, I was pleased and flattered that Doubleday decided that this was an adult book. They wanted to market it to an adult market. But it also clearly does have an appeal to younger ages. And as a matter of fact, we did an interview recently with sort of a literary publication, and there were 3 people interviewing us, and they all sort of emphatically spoke about how they felt it defied categorization, that to define it was sort of to betray it, because it was to alienate one audience or another. Yes? Portability is good, always good.
There's also kind of a gifty quality that we wanted it to feel like, that this is a book that can. Where did we read somewhere said this is something that should be on a bedstand? People in a bedstand in your guest bedroom, which is a really nice thing if you have a guest bedroom. You have to get that first. Go ahead.
I was going to ask about the music and how you chose a particular score or piece written for this, or what's the...
Yeah, we specifically wrote music for the movie, and Gowan is a wonderful musician who I work with in other realms of music, producing records and performing. And so I called him up and had him come over, and I had a real idea. I actually already temped out some some guitar pieces as sort of a template, but I felt like working with Gowan, we'd be able to improve it and make it better. And I think, I felt like the music for the piece should be sort of motifs. I didn't want it to be a melody that went on and on and on. It's like, it was important that there be moments of breath, breathing moments, because I think the book sort of has that and sort of lulls you into being able to ponder it, not just being carried away, but given your own space. So Gowan and I worked together to sort of create motifs and sort of put together a bunch of ideas, and then I sort of assembled them in Pro Tools to connect the whole story.
I want to address a little notion about the music, if I could, Tom. But it has to do with this idea of what your mind's eye and mind's ear has in it. And this whole thing about collaboration, this has been an entire experiment for both of us. And I know that you all here work in a highly collaborative environment. And Tom and I, in many ways, don't. I don't work very collaboratively. I'm very isolated because I draw for a living and I get briefs and then I go and do my thing. And the interesting thing is when you then put two visions together, even though neither of you very clearly declare what the visions are, when the other one sort of puts a line out there in the sand, your vision becomes very clear and it becomes easier to articulate it because there's sort of a starting point. It says, okay, well, that is what I was thinking, or it isn't. And fortunately for us, we were always jiving. I mean, we were really, really in sync much of the time. And I'm bringing this back around to the music because the book was completed when we decided to build the website. And I was really excited to get to work with Tom musically because I said, let's put music to this thing. And much like I worked, Tom worked alone and did the music. And I was building the animations. I scripted them and then had a Flash expert put them together. And the music sort of showed up. And I said, that's exactly what I was thinking. But it's not, there's no way in the world I could have articulated that. I mean, I'm not musical by any means, and professionally. I can hear a good tune. But it didn't have to be that way, but it did. And that's what I think is kind of interesting. It's like, oh, that's a vibe I was thinking, and that has the spirit of this story. And, I don't know whether that's luck or a combination of luck or kind of being in the same place together. But it's, when I would say that doesn't always happen. And I don't know how it is down here with very large collaborations. You find that the challenge is to get your visions in sync, even though your visions are very undefined. And I think we made a good run at it after a year and a half of colliding.
Yeah.
You didn't talk about the story development. I mean, the initial picture is interesting, but to spend 100 pages out of that seems like it has to be a longer process.
Well, it's interesting. I really feel like the best creative moments for me in music or otherwise are when I'm really out of the way. When I'm not trying really hard to manipulate something, but it's sort of channeling through me and I can feel the flow happening and I like what's coming out. And I think Mr. Fooster happened much that way. Certainly there were moments where I thought, well, where would he go next? Where might I take him? But it was less like, where might I take him? And more like, well, let's see where he's going to go. And sort of open the channel up to it and let him come out. And of course I would have ideas along the way, but it was less of a forced manipulation and more of sort of a flow and letting it come through me.
I think were there 2 or 3 moments in there that you had seen original drawings where he picks up the water, a couple things that gave you points in the story.
That's a great part of the collaboration was, once I presented the manuscript and Craig agreed to do the project, I said, Craig, because I feel like any one of your illustrations speaks so deeply to me, it would be great if I could have access to your archives. And because I feel like some of your past illustrations might influence this story. I might see a place I would like to take him to. And there were a number of those. I mean, there was a scene where he gathers up the water in his arms. That was based on an illustration Craig had done earlier, and I just loved it so much. I thought, well, how can I bring that to the story? And there's also this illustration, which is one of my more favorite moments of the book, where Mr. Fooster is rowing a rowboat over the ocean, but the rowboat is floating about 10 feet over the water. And I saw that, and wow, I would love to bring him to that moment. And in that, Craig's work, I think, is deeply metaphorical, and I'd like to think Mr. Fooster's ride is also metaphorical. And in that scene, as an example, I didn't want to suggest that was necessarily what was happening literally. And there is no reference to that happening literally. It's just a moment where he feels the day takes on a lighter feeling, and his rowing becomes easier. And I thought that was a really nice balance. And so, that was something Craig had done previously. And so the story was influenced by Craig's art along the way, not only by the first illustration. Yes?
I was just curious if either or both of you have a favorite illustration.
The question is whether we have a favorite illustration. And it's really, it's hard for me to choose one. And that particular one with him rowing in the rowboat over the water, I do love very much.
That's one of my faves. It's up there. Yes.
Yeah.
Was the publishing company at all, how did they react to the fact that you were putting this on the web?
Oh, they were in complete support of. The question was, how did the publishing company feel about putting the book up on the web? And they were fully supportive of it. They thought it was great.
It's a huge part of book marketing now. It's a big part. I mean, to the extent that they helped underwrite it. And they loved what we did, the way we did it. We gave them a little script of what we kind of thought that should be on the site, and they were all behind it. It's a big, big part of it. In fact, I wonder if you guys could help us get some more people to the site.
Do you know anything about that?
No, just the first 3 chapters. Yeah, it's not as much as you'd want. I mean, it's hard to drive traffic. I mean, and I say that because it'd be lovely to have millions of people seeing it. The MrFooster.com, we got that real early on. It's been on every piece of literature that's been done, promotional material for it. And, we get all kinds of spikes and all the stuff that everybody does. But, God, there's a lot of really nice websites out there.
Yeah.
About the traffic, I noticed that the website is all Flash, and that might be part of it because for people who cannot load Flash or people who cannot read, for instance, the website is completely inaccessible.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So that's just keeping visibility in mind.
Yes.
With so many different forms of the work, like with the music and the movie and the book itself, how does it feel to have so many different versions of it out there? And do you feel like there's one that you want? Would people say, "Oh, I watched the movie, oh, we should really see the book," or "I read the book, so we should really see it with music"? How does that feel to have so many different experiences?
The question is, with the book out in the world in so many forms, in a visual, in a movie form, in a printed form, and with music, how do we feel about it being out there in so many different categories, and does that feel disjointed? And I would say, to me, it really all feels like one. And I haven't had any thoughts about there being a disconnection. I think one, hopefully one leads to the other, and I haven't spent too much time pondering it. I just trust that one does lead to the other ultimately. And even if it doesn't, that it has hopefully some meaning or contribution to make.
The interesting thing is that all the reading and the music is all part of the marketing of that book. I mean, I think we love the book because it's all there. Everything we did is right in there. But I'm, after the fact, I think, God, I kind of wish we'd have done a DVD on this thing because it's so beautiful. I mean, Tom reads it so beautifully, and the music that the two of you have made with it, just so much compliments, and it's a different kind of story. I mean, we've done this in a few different venues, and I don't tire of it at all. So,
I think we have to close this up. So we'll take one more question.
Could I ask a question? Okay, we'll take your question
We'll take
first.
2 more questions. one will be yours, Craig. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that the music seems like such a part of it now, having heard you do it and watching the chapter, that it would be cool, you know, if maybe would drive more people to the website, if you could just like listen to the music while you're reading it or something, and that way you could, you know, if you're reading it to a child, you could have the music. And it really seems to.
So you're suggesting including a CD with the book, so people are CDs, I guess, are antiquated at this point. A flash drive.
You have some sort of loop on the site, so you can just press
On the homepage, I see.
just continue to play, just so that you can play it in the background while you're reading.
Oh, that's interesting. That's it. Yeah, I'll just say that the suggestion is that we have the music available on the site just to loop, so people could actually read the book to the music as it plays. That's a really neat idea. Craig, did you have a question?
I just had a question of all of you. What is it like to work at Google? This is really a pleasure to come down here.
Yeah.
It really, really is. What was the answer? Oh. Just like that, huh? Well, thank you so much for hosting
Thanks
us.
so much.